For more than a decade, WOLED display technology has relied on a dedicated white subpixel. This new ASUS ROG Swift PG32UCWM is the first 31.5-inch WOLED monitor on the market to get rid of the white subpixel in favor of an RGB striped subpixel layout. Now, in case you're wondering, yes, it is still called a WOLED despite the absence of a white subpixel. I will explain why in just a moment. The first and most important benefit of the RGB striped pixel structure is undoubtedly its text clarity, since the text rendering of most desktop operating systems is optimized for a vertically arranged red, green, and blue subpixel configuration, in that order. Compared with the latest generation QD-OLED panel, which has also moved to an RGB striped layout, the difference in size between the red and blue subpixels is not as pronounced, contributing to arguably the cleanest and sharpest text rendition I've seen on an OLED monitor since the JOLED panel, which has been discontinued for a good few years now, even at 100% scaling. If you go really close up to the screen, look from an angle, and move your head around like you're at a rave party in Ibiza, you might still spot the faintest hint of fringing caused by LG Display's dithering algorithm. But from any normal viewing distance you would actually use a monitor, it's essentially a total non-issue. Before we move on, let's quickly answer the obvious question. Why is it still called WOLED if there's no white subpixel anymore? Well, the W in WOLED actually refers to the white emitting OLED stack itself, rather than the presence of a dedicated white subpixel. The OLED material still emits broadband white light, which then passes through color filters to form the red, green, and blue subpixels. What has changed is that the dedicated white subpixel has simply been removed from the pixel structure, giving us this new RGB striped layout. Now, removing the white subpixel inevitably comes with a trade-off. Without the additional white element helping to boost luminance, HDR brightness was always going to take a hit, and so it proved with our measurements. Across all available HDR picture presets out of the box, HDR peak brightness measured around 440 nits on a 10% window at D65 white point, and close to 240 nits full fill, slightly less than the 250 nits required for VISA's Display HDR True Black 400 certification, suggesting that our review sample may have landed towards the dimmer end of normal unit-to-unit variation. That said, when watching real-world HDR content, the PG32UCWM frequently looked perceptually as bright, if not brighter, than conventional WOLED monitors equipped with a white subpixel. The reason is that without white subpixel dilution, saturated colors retain much more of their luminance, producing what's known as the Helmholtz-Kohlrausch effect, where more saturated colors appear perceptually brighter than less saturated colors at the same measured luminance. I'm not even sure I'm pronouncing Helmholtz-Kohlrausch correctly. Sometimes I don't really know what I'm doing with my tongue, so let's just call it the HK effect. The practical takeaway is that although the PG32UCWM measures dimmer than previous WOLED monitors, it often doesn't look that way to the human eye. If you switch on the adjustable HDR toggle and increase the brightness setting from the default value of 70 to the maximum of 100 in the Gaming HDR, Cinema HDR, and Console HDR picture presets, the monitor can hit around 1000 nits on a 2% window. However, PQEOTF tracking becomes significantly overbrightened, leading to raised shadows and midtones that deviate from the creative intent. So we would recommend sticking with the default brightness setting of 70 in these picture presets, or simply use the Display HDR 400 True Black mode. For watching HDR movies, Cinema HDR remains the best choice because its HDR10 tone mapping responds to max MDL or maximum mastering display luminance metadata, allowing for better preservation of bright highlight detail in HDR content graded to 1000 or 4000 nits. The ASUS PG32UCWM also supports player-led or low-latency Dolby Vision once you manually enable it in the user menu. While repeatedly running these HDR test patterns over the course of our testing, one potential benefit of removing the white subpixel quickly became apparent. Let me show you. If we display a peak white HDR window for 10 seconds, then switch to a full fill gray slide, you can see there's essentially no image retention at all, with only the slightest hint of afterglow. We would like to think that removing the dedicated white subpixel has played a significant role in this class-leading resistance to image retention by WOLED standards. That said, ASUS has also equipped the PG32UCWM with a custom heatsink and gallium nitride technology, both of which may have contributed as well, so we can't say for certain how much of the improvement is down to the new RGB striped subpixel architecture alone. However, not everything improved. Despite the removal of the white subpixel, we were surprised to find that the ASUS PG32UCWM still exhibited some near-black chrominance overshoot artifacts in extremely demanding torture test scenes, such as this moving near-black quantization pattern developed by Stacy Spears of Spears and Mansell fame, not to mention heavily compressed material like this broadcast recording of Game of Thrones. So perhaps the white subpixel isn't entirely responsible for the flashing artifacts we've seen on WOLED panels over the years. Fortunately, we did not observe chrominance overshoot when feeding the monitor a high-quality video signal, which any respectable PC should be capable of delivering. While we're on the subject of PCs, let's talk about gaming. Using a Leo-Bodnar tester, input lag measured 8.6 milliseconds at 60 frames per second, 4.4 milliseconds at 120 FPS, and a super responsive 2.4 milliseconds at 240 FPS. Beyond reducing input lag, pairing a 240 FPS video signal with the monitor's native 240Hz refresh rate also delivered superb motion clarity free of black smearing artifacts, thanks to OLED's near instantaneous pixel response time. While the headline refresh rate is 240Hz, or even 480Hz in frame rate boost mode, the PG32UCWM had no trouble handling 24, 25, 50 and 60 FPS content, presenting smooth motion without frame skipping or frame rate conversion judder. For gamers whose PCs cannot sustain very high frame rates, ASUS also provides an ELMB black frame insertion or BFI mode to improve the motion clarity of 120 FPS gameplay. However, enabling ELMB disables both HDR and VRR while increasing input lag, so we don't expect many users to take advantage of it. The monitor's dual mode can be activated either via an assigned physical hotkey or through the frame rate boost setting, switching to 480Hz refresh rate at 1920x1080 resolution, though based on putting the frame rate boost mode under the microscope, literally, it's not using a mathematically perfect integer scaling. Feeding the monitor a 480 FPS signal at 480Hz delivered the highest motion clarity and lowest latency it is capable of. The trade-off is that near-black gamma becomes elevated, causing shadow detail and to a lesser extent midtones to appear brighter than reference. While this can be partially compensated in SDR by reducing the gamma setting by one step, no equivalent adjustment is available in HDR since the gamma control is disabled. VRR including NVIDIA G-Sync delivered smooth gameplay without frame drops or tearing artifacts. As with every OLED monitor we have tested so far, VRR flicker remained unavoidable in a handful of titles, particularly on static menus, although both its frequency and severity were noticeably lower than what we've observed on larger OLED TVs. ASUS also provides an OLED anti-flicker setting that narrows the VRR operating range to reduce flicker, but in practice, the VRR window became so restricted that frame rates frequently fall outside it, resulting in noticeable stuttering, so we did not find the feature particularly useful. In terms of connectivity, the ASUS PG32UCWM is very well spec'd with inbuilt KVM support, providing a DisplayPort 2.1a input with the full USB R20 80 gigabits per second bandwidth, two HDMI ports offering the full 48 gigabits per second HDMI 2.1 and DSC specifications, as well as a USB-C DisplayPort with 90 watt power delivery. In console HDR mode, Max TML and Max FFTML clipped at 450 nits, allowing HDRG-compliant HDR games to be displayed without being subjected to double tone mapping. Color reproduction was generally excellent. Out of the box, most SDR picture presets tracked a wider color gamut, making them inaccurate for consuming SDR content mastered in the sRGB or Rec. 709 color space. The obvious exception is the sRGB Cal picture mode, which arrived very well calibrated from the factory, yielding an average delta error of just 1.22 on our 140 patch color checker SG test, with no inaccuracies exceeding the humanly perceptible threshold of delta error 3. The only downside is that many picture controls are grayed out in the sRGB color mode, so if you prefer watching SDR material in a dimly lit room, we would recommend switching to the user picture mode instead, changing display color space to sRGB, then selecting a gamma of 2.4, which produces a more cinematic SDR presentation with greater pop and depth. For HDR, DCI-P3 color gamut coverage measured almost 99.5% in UV terms, while Rec 1020 coverage approached 80%, backed by a spectral power distribution that manifested more distinct red, green, and blue peaks than previous WOLED panels equipped with a white subpixel. Combined with the high color luminance we discussed earlier, white color gamut HDR content looked rich, vibrant, and highly impactful. Color volume measured higher than conventional WOLED equipped with white subpixels, though it still fell behind the latest generation of QD OLEDs, which can go brighter than this first generation RGB striped tandem WOLED panel. Like many modern displays we've tested in recent years, colors could still appear somewhat desaturated in very dark scenes. Of course, color accuracy measured at the center of the screen tells only part of the story, because WOLED panels can exhibit slight tint variations across different areas of the image. Bright field uniformity was very good on our review sample, with no obvious banding or dirty screen effect visible on full field gray slides. However, because WOLED remains susceptible to off-axis color shift, the outer edges of the screen could take on a mild tint relative to the center even when viewed head-on, simply because they are being observed from a slightly more oblique angle. In this clip, where the monitor is rotated on a motorized turntable, you can see the tint migrate across the screen as the viewing angle changes. That said, from a normal desktop viewing distance with the PG32UCWM positioned directly in front of us, we did not consider it a deal breaker, since a monitor is rarely viewed from such extreme angles, and any tinting towards the edges of a 31.5-inch display is much less noticeable than on a larger WOLED TV. Dark uniformity was also better than what we've typically witnessed on WOLED televisions, exhibiting no significant vertical streaks or gel bars on near black full field slides, or in challenging low light scenes from real-world HDR content. QD OLED monitors remain just that bit cleaner in terms of dark uniformity, but the gap has narrowed considerably. One surprise was the presence of some extremely faint horizontal streaks between 5% and 15% video stimulus. Combined with the panel's vertically oriented fine dithering pattern, these could produce a subtle tissue paper texture that was noticeable at close range and occasionally revealed itself on websites using dark mode. We did not find it particularly distracting, but it's worth mentioning that it was present on our review unit. Native template gradation was generally very good, judging by this rotating quantization test pattern from the Spears & Munsell UHD HDR benchmark disc, the grayscale ramp from the Display HDR app, as well as challenging skies in The Martian. Towards black, posterization did become slightly more apparent, occasionally manifesting as a subtle rippling effect during fade to black or fade in from black transitions. Design-wise, the true black glossy screen coating on the ASUS ROG Swift PG32UCWM is beautiful. There's no haziness, no grain, imparting outstanding sharpness and clarity to the image. Yes, you can see more reflections than on a matte screen, but because they are in a different focal plane to the image itself, they actually enhance the perceived sense of depth. Furthermore, unlike QD OLED, the blacks don't turn as gray when hit by direct ambient light, maintaining high ambient contrast in a bright room. As you can probably tell by now, I'm a big fan of this wet, glossy look. Even though the picture quality from the front is the main bread and butter of any monitor, we have to say the rear of the PG32UCWM oozes quality too, with the transparent shell revealing some of the monitor's internal components being a stylish touch. There's also RGB lighting behind the ROG logo, the effect of which can be customized in the user menu, although we couldn't help but feel that not illuminating the transparent section itself was a missed opportunity. The claw stand, which has become something of a signature for ASUS ROG Swift gaming monitors, provides solid stability but occupies a fair amount of desk space. We suspect many users would actually prefer the more compact footprint of the ROG Strix stand. ASUS has implemented a comprehensive suite of anti-screen burn measures, including various auto-dimming controls, pixel cleaning compensation cycles, pixel shifting, and logo luminance adjustment. Similar to most OLED monitors we've tested so far, there's also a small amount of pixel oval provisioning beyond the native 3840x2160 resolution, meaning pixel shifting never causes even the slightest amount of picture cropping around the edges. ASUS also backs the PG32UCWM with a 3-year warranty that covers OLED burn-in. In addition, the company has refined its Neo proximity sensor technology, which automatically turns off the screen when no one is detected nearby. The detection distance, activation delay, and motion sensitivity can all be customized in the user menu. From our testing, it worked much more reliably than previous implementations, making it a genuinely useful protective measure for anyone who regularly steps away from their desk. Let's sum up. The ASUS ROG Swift PG32UCWM demonstrates that removing the dedicated white subpixel is a meaningful step forward for WOLED technology. The new RGB stripe subpixel layout delivers improved text clarity and higher color luminance free from white subpixel dilution, and it may also be responsible for making this one of the most image retention resistant WOLED displays we have tested to date. Add OLED's traditional strengths of absolute blacks, wide viewing angles, and near instantaneous pixel response time, not to mention the high-quality, glossy anti-reflective coating which enhances the perceived sense of depth while maintaining strong ambient contrast, and the result is an impressive monitor for both gaming and desktop productivity. And so the ASUS PG32UCWM receives our recommended award. Of course, no monitor is perfect. Removing the white subpixel also means lower peak luminance, although this is compensated to a certain degree by the HK effect, such that colorful HDR content rarely looked dimmer than conventional WOLED panels that measure brighter on paper. Likewise, the move to an RGB striped subpixel structure doesn't appear to have eliminated the color uniformity and off-axis tinting characteristics we've come to associate with WOLED technology. Now, you may be wondering how this new RGB striped tandem WOLED stacks up against QD-OLED, in which case you might want to check out my full review of an ASUS ROG QD-OLED gaming monitor by clicking here.